classroom felt smaller that day, like the walls had inched closer overnight. I remember how the fluorescent lights buzzed above us, casting that sickly glow that made everyone look slightly unwell. It was early spring, 1998, and I was 11 years old, sitting in my usual spot, third row, second seat from the left, in Ms. Peterson's 6th grade English class. "Aaliyah, would you please read the next paragraph?" Ms. Peterson's voice carried that particularly pointed tone she reserved just for me. I cleared my throat, finger finding my place on page 43 of our literature textbook. "The protagonist's journey reflects the universal struggle to find meaning in an indifferent world," I read, my voice clear but carrying the subtle cadence and rhythm that was distinctly mine, distinctly us, the way my family spoke, the way my neighborhood sounded. "Stop!" Ms. Peterson's interruption sliced through the air. The classroom froze. 26 pairs of eyes swiveled between her and me. "Aaliyah, how many times do I need to remind you to speak properly in my classroom?" Her thin lips pulled tighter, making the fine lines around her mouth more pronounced. "This is an educational environment. We use proper English here." I felt heat rush to my face, that familiar burning sensation of being singled out. What I didn't know, what Miss Peterson certainly didn't know, was that my mother had arrived early for our parent-teacher conference, scheduled after school. She stood just outside the partially open classroom door, hearing every word. I was speaking properly," I said quietly, the textbook suddenly heavy in my hands. Miss Peterson sighed dramatically, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "No, you were not. You were using that neighborhood talk again. How do you expect to succeed in life if you can't communicate like an educated person?" The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Then, from the doorway, came a sound that changed everything. My mother clearing her throat. Dr. Janelle Washington, professor of linguistics at Howard University, author of 3 books on African American vernacular English, and the most formidable force I've ever known, stepped into Miss Peterson's classroom. What happened next would not only change how I saw myself, but would reverberate through my life in ways I couldn't possibly imagine at 11 years old. My relationship with language had always been complicated. At home, we spoke with the natural cadence of our heritage, the rich, expressive patterns that had been passed down through generations. My father, with his Mississippi roots, spoke with a melodic southern drawl that danced on your ears. My mother, the academic, could code switch effortlessly between the rhythm of our home language and the rigid structures of academia. "Language is power, Aaliyah," my mother would tell me as she braided my hair each morning. "And knowing how to use different languages for different situations, that's superpower." But at Jefferson Middle School, there seemed to be only one acceptable way to speak. Miss Peterson had made that clear from my first day in her class. Catherine Peterson was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair always pulled back in a tight bun. She'd been teaching at Jefferson for over 25 years and prided herself on maintaining standards. She wore tweed skirts regardless of the weather and collected ceramic apples that lined her desk, gifts from former students who had made something of themselves. As she often reminded us, since September, Ms. Peterson had been correcting my speech, interrupting my class participation, making me repeat words, sighing heavily whenever I answered questions. At first, I tried harder to speak properly, swallowing my natural intonations and forcing my words into shapes that felt foreign in my mouth. By spring, though, a quiet resistance had built inside me. I stopped raising my hand as much. When called upon, I kept my answers brief. I began to believe that maybe my voice, my actual voice, didn't belong in academic spaces. Then came that Tuesday in April. "Excuse me," my mother said, her voice calm but carrying that unmistakable authority that had silenced lecture halls full of graduate students. She stood in the doorway, elegant in her charcoal pantsuit, her locks pulled back in a professional style. "I believe I'm a bit early for our conference, Miss Peterson, but perhaps now is a good time after all." Miss Peterson's face registered first. Confusion, then recognition, then, most visibly, alarm. She quickly recovered, plastering on a professional smile. "Dr. Washington! Yes, we had 3:30 scheduled, but—" She glanced at the classroom clock. "We still have 20 minutes of class. Perhaps you could wait in the main office?" My mother smiled. Not the warm smile I knew from home, but her public smile, the one that revealed nothing. "Actually, I think I'll stay. Please, continue with your lesson. Pretend I'm not even here." Every student in that room, myself included, knew that pretending Dr. Janelle Washington wasn't there was about as possible as pretending a supernova wasn't lighting up the sky. Miss Peterson hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "As you wish." She turned back to me. "Aaliyah, please continue reading. And remember what we discussed about proper pronunciation." My throat felt tight. I looked at my mother, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. I took a deep breath and continued reading. In my voice, my actual voice, the protagonist's struggle mirrors our own search for meaning, I read, no longer trying to flatten my natural cadence. Through her journey, we see reflected the universal questions that define humanity. Miss Peterson's mouth opened to interrupt me again, but my mother cleared her throat softly. The interruption died before it reached air. I finished the paragraph and looked up. The classroom remained silent. Miss Peterson's face had settled into a tight mask as she instructed Timothy Garcia to read the next section. For the remainder of those 20 minutes, my mother sat at the back of the classroom, observing silently. I could feel her presence like a protective shield. And for the first time in months, I relaxed in my seat. When the dismissal bell rang, Miss Peterson announced, "Class dismissed. Aaliyah, you may stay for our conference." As my classmates filed out, many casting curious glances back at my mother, I gathered my books slowly, heart pounding. Whatever was coming, I knew it would be significant. Once the room emptied, my mother closed the classroom door and turned to face Miss Peterson, who had positioned herself behind her desk like it was a fortress. "Miss Peterson," my mother began, her voice measured. "I'd like to understand what you meant when you asked my daughter to speak properly. Could you elaborate on that for me?" Miss Peterson straightened the stack of papers on her desk. "Dr. Washington, surely as an educated woman yourself, you understand the importance of standard English in academic and professional settings. Aaliyah uses colloquialisms and informal speech patterns that will limit her future opportunities if not corrected." My mother nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And what qualifies as proper English in your classroom?" "Correct grammar, standard pronunciation, comprehensive vocabulary, the foundations of communication in educated society," Miss Peterson replied with growing confidence. "I see." My mother pulled a chair next to mine, sitting down and crossing her legs. "Miss Peterson, are you familiar with code switching?" "Vaguely," Miss Peterson admitted, wariness creeping into her expression. "It's the practice of alternating between language varieties depending on social context. My daughter is quite skilled at it, actually. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder. What you're interpreting as improper English is actually African American Vernacular English, AAVE, a legitimate linguistic form with consistent internal logic, complex grammatical rules, and a rich historical context. Ms. Peterson's lips thinned. Dr. Washington, while I respect your academic perspective, my responsibility is to prepare these children for the real world, a world where, like it or not, they will be judged by how they speak. Oh, I'm intimately familiar with that world, Miss Peterson. My mother's smile remained pleasant, but her eyes had hardened. The question is whether we perpetuate that judgment or educate against it. The tension in the room was palpable. I sat quietly, watching these two women, both educators, both convinced of their righteousness, face off over something as fundamental as how I spoke. Perhaps we could compromise, Miss Peterson offered. Aaliyah clearly has the capacity for standard English. I'm simply encouraging her to use it consistently. My mother leaned forward slightly. What you're actually doing is suggesting that her natural voice, the linguistic patterns she's grown up with, that connect her to her community and cultural heritage, is somehow deficient or inappropriate. That's not... Let me finish, please. My mother's tone left no room for interruption. When you correct her speech in front of her peers, you're not just critiquing her grammar. You're sending a message about who belongs in academic spaces and whose knowledge is valued. Miss Peterson's face flushed. That is absolutely not my intention. Impact outweighs intention, Miss Peterson. My mother's voice softened slightly. Let me ask you this. When Timothy was reading earlier, I noticed he pronounced ask as AKSK. Did you correct him? Miss Peterson hesitated. That's different. Timothy is white. My mother finished for her. Yes, he is. And when he mispronounces words, it's an individual error. When Aaliyah uses AAV speech patterns that are grammatically consistent within their own linguistic system, it's somehow a failure requiring public correction. I looked between them, watching Miss Peterson's certainty crumble slightly. I've spent my career studying how language and power intersect, my mother continued. And I can tell you that what's happening in this classroom isn't preparing Aaliyah for the real world. It's teaching her that her authentic voice has no place in education, that she must erase parts of herself to be considered intelligent or worthy. The silence that followed felt electric. Miss Peterson removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Dr. Washington, I've been teaching for nearly 30 years. My methods have helped countless students succeed. And how many of those students looked like Aaliyah? Oh, my mother asked. How many came from neighborhoods like ours? How many had to leave their cultural identities at the door to earn your approval? Miss Peterson had no immediate answer. My mother stood, straightening her jacket. I'd like to propose something, if I may. Rather than a parent-teacher conference about my daughter's perceived deficiencies, what if I gave your class a presentation on linguistic diversity? It might benefit everyone to understand that proper English is itself a construct born of historical power dynamics. The look of alarm that crossed Miss Peterson's face almost made me laugh. I don't think that's necessary, she said quickly. I think it's exactly what's necessary, my mother countered. Unless you'd prefer I discuss this matter with Principal Hargrove instead. I'm sure he'd be interested in how linguistic discrimination manifests in Jefferson's English curriculum. I watched my normally confident teacher deflate slightly, That won't be necessary, Ms. Peterson said finally. When would you like to do this presentation? Tomorrow would be perfect, my mother replied with a smile. I happen to have a gap in my teaching schedule. As we left the classroom, I felt both triumphant and terrified. My mother had defended me, yes, but tomorrow she would be back in that classroom, and so would I, facing the aftermath. That evening, as we prepared dinner together, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me since we left school. Mom, did you embarrass me today, or save me? I sliced cucumbers for the salad, while she stirred the jambalaya. She laughed, the sound warm and familiar in our kitchen. Probably a little of both, baby. That's how motherhood works sometimes. Ms. Peterson hates me now, I said, the knife pausing against the cutting board. No. My mother turned down the heat under the pot and faced me fully. Ms. Peterson is confronting her own biases now. There's a difference. I resumed chopping, unconvinced. Everyone's going to stare at me tomorrow. Yes, they probably will. She didn't sugarcoat it. And you're going to hold your head high and remember that your voice, all aspects of your voice, belongs in every room you enter. But what if she's right? The question came out smaller than I intended. What if the way we talk really will hold me back? My mother's expression softened. She took the knife from my hand and set it down, then held both my hands in hers. Listen to me, Aaliyah. Code switching is a skill, one you already possess. Using different language varieties in different contexts shows intelligence, not deficiency. But no one gets to tell you that your natural voice is wrong or less than. No one. Even teachers? Especially teachers, she said firmly. Their job is to expand your world, not shrink it to fit their comfort zone. And tomorrow? I asked. What exactly are you going to do? A slow smile spread across my mother's face. I'm going to do what I do best, baby. I'm going to teach. Katana, the next day, I walked into English class, with my stomach in knots. Word had somehow spread, as it always does in middle school, that something big had happened between my mother and Ms. Peterson. My classmates whispered as I passed, conversations pausing when I came near. Ms. Peterson was subdued, taking attendance without meeting anyone's eyes. When she got to my name, there was a slight pause before she said, Aaliyah Washington. Present, I answered, my voice deliberately carrying its natural cadence. At exactly 10:15, there was a knock at the classroom door. My mother entered, but not alone. Behind her came two of her graduate students, Marcus, a tall man with glasses and a bow tie, and Kiana, whose colorful head wrap matched her bright smile. Good morning, everyone. My mother greeted the class. Thank you, Ms. Peterson, for allowing us this opportunity. She nodded to my teacher, who managed a tight smile in return. Class, we have special guest today, Ms. Peterson announced, her voice strained with forced enthusiasm. This is Dr. Washington from Howard University, and her associates. They're here to talk about linguistic diversity. The way she said those last two words made them sound like an exotic disease. My mother stepped forward, commanding the room, instantly. How many of you speak more than one language? She asked. About a third of the hands went up. Impressive! And those of you who raised your hands, do you think knowing multiple languages makes you smarter or less smart? Smarter! Several voices called out. That's right, my mother agreed. Multilingual brains actually develop different cognitive advantages. Now, what if I told you that many of you in this room are already bidialectal, even if you only speak English." Confused faces looked back at her. For the next 40 minutes, my mother and her graduate students gave an engaging presentation on language varieties, code switching, and the history of linguistic discrimination in America. They played audio clips of different English dialects, had students identify patterns, and led a discussion about when and why we change how we speak in different situations. "Language is alive," my mother explained, writing the words on the board. "It evolves, adapts, and serves the needs of its speakers. There is no proper English, only different varieties appropriate for different contexts." I watched my classmates, becoming engaged, raising hands, asking questions. Even Timothy, who usually spent class doodling in his notebook, was paying attention. Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. My mother turned to me. "Aaliyah, would you be willing to help us demonstrate something?" I nodded slowly, standing up. "I'd like you to read this paragraph twice," she said, handing me a sheet of paper. "First in what Ms. Peterson might call standard English, and then in the way you might speak with family or friends." I looked at Ms. Peterson, whose face had gone carefully blank, and then at my classmates, who watched with undisguised curiosity. Taking a deep breath, I began reading in my most proper voice, the one I'd been forcing myself to use in class for months. When I finished, there was silence. "And now," my mother prompted gently, "the same paragraph, but in your natural voice." I read it again, allowing my words to flow with the rhythms and patterns I'd grown up with. The difference wasn't dramatic, it wasn't like switching from English to French, but it was noticeable in the cadence, the contractions, the slight variations in pronunciation. When I finished the second reading, Marcus asked the class, "What differences did you notice?" Hands shot up. Students pointed out specific words I'd pronounced differently, patterns in how I'd contracted certain phrases, the musical quality that had entered my voice in the second reading. "Did you understand both versions?" Kiana asked the class. Everyone nodded. "So the difference isn't about comprehension," my mother concluded. "It's about expectation and perception. And those expectations are often rooted in historical and social power dynamics, rather than linguistic correctness." She turned to face Ms. Peterson directly. "When we insist on one correct way of speaking, especially in educational settings, we're often enforcing cultural dominance rather than linguistic clarity." The classroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. "Thank you for that illuminating presentation, Dr. Washington," Ms. Peterson finally said. Her voice was controlled, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted. Her glasses. After my mother and her students left, the class felt different. I could feel curious glances from my classmates. But they weren't mocking. They seemed thoughtful, maybe even respectful. Miss Peterson didn't meet my eyes for the rest of the period. When the bell rang, she simply said, "We'll continue with Chapter 7 tomorrow. Class dismissed." As I gathered my books, Deshaun Williams, who rarely spoke to anyone, paused by my desk. "Your mom's dope," he said quietly, and continued toward the door. I walked out of that classroom standing taller than I had in months. Tiradonast. The weeks that followed were strange. Ms. Peterson didn't suddenly become a different person. She still valued standard English and maintained her high expectations. But something fundamental had shifted. She stopped interrupting me when I spoke. She began acknowledging different speech patterns as variations rather than errors. And most importantly, she started listening to what students were saying rather than focusing exclusively on how they said it. One afternoon, about a month after my mother's presentation, Miss Peterson asked me to stay after class. My heart sank. Had it all been temporary? Was she going back to her old ways now that the threat of my mother's involvement had faded? I approached her desk cautiously. "Aaliyah," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to thank you. Of all the things I'd expected her to say, that wasn't on the list." "Thank me? For what?" Miss Peterson removed her glasses, cleaning them with the cloth she kept in her desk drawer. "For your patience with me, and for what I've learned through you and your mother's intervention." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I remained silent. "I've been teaching for 28 years, she continued. "In that time, I've developed certain certainties about education, about what students need to succeed." She put her glasses back on, focusing on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "It's not easy to have those certainties challenged." "No, ma'am," I agreed quietly. "Your mother made me uncomfortable," she admitted. "But discomfort often precedes growth. I've been doing some reading since her visit about linguistic diversity, code switching, the history of language as a tool of ensuring certain voices are valued over others." I blinked, surprised by her candor. "I want you to know that while I still believe in maintaining high standards, I recognize now that those standards needn't be so narrow." She straightened a stack of papers on her desk. "Your voice, all aspects of your voice, belongs in this classroom." It was almost exactly what my mother had told me in our kitchen. Hearing it from Ms. Peterson left me momentarily speechless. "Thank you," I managed finally. She nodded once, a gesture of dismissal, but as I turned to leave, she added, "And Aaliyah, you have important things to say. I apologize for focusing so much on how you said them that I sometimes missed what you were saying." I walked out of that classroom feeling something I hadn't expected to feel toward Miss Peterson. Respect. It takes courage to examine your own biases. It takes even more courage to acknowledge them to the person you've harmed. That spring marked a turning point for me, not just in how I navigated school, but in how I understood my voice and its power. I stopped trying to contort myself into shapes that didn't fit me. I embraced code switching as the superpower my mother had always told me it was, moving between language varieties with increasing confidence. By the end of the school year, I'd found my voice in more ways than one. I joined the debate team. I started writing for the school paper. I raised my hand in class without second-guessing how my answers would sound. Ms. Peterson and I reached an understanding that, while not exactly warm, was built on mutual respect. She challenged me academically without trying to erase the cultural markers in my speech. I met her high standards while remaining authentically myself. On the last day of school, she handed back our final essays. Mine had an A at the top and a note in her precise handwriting. "Your voice shines through beautifully here. Never dim it for anyone." I showed the note to my mother that evening. She smiled, pulling me into a tight hug. "The greatest gift we can give the world is our authentic selves," she said, kissing the top of my head. "I'm so proud you're learning that lesson early." 22 years later, I still think about that spring often. How one moment of intervention, one person refusing to let me be diminished, changed the trajectory of my life. I became an English teacher myself, specializing in creative writing and linguistic anthropology. I've made it my mission to create classrooms where all voices are not just tolerated, but celebrated. where students understand that language is a living thing shaped by culture, history, and community. Last month, while attending an educational conference in Baltimore, I spotted a familiar figure in the hotel lobby. Older now, hair completely silver, but unmistakable in her tweed skirt and sensible shoes. Ms. Peterson was sitting alone, reviewing what appeared to be conference materials. I hesitated only briefly before approaching her table. "Ms. Peterson." She looked up, confusion crossing her face before recognition dawned. "Aaliyah Washington?" "My goodness, it's been years." "It has," I agreed, smiling. "May I join you?" She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Please do. Are you attending the conference?" "I am. I'm presenting tomorrow on inclusive language practices in secondary education." Her eyebrows raised slightly. "You became a teacher." "I did," I confirmed. "You had more influence than you might have realized." A shadow of something, regret, embarrassment, crossed her face. "I hope not all of it negative." "Not at all," I assured her. "You taught me the importance of high standards. You pushed me academically in ways I needed. And that spring, when my mother intervened, you showed me that growth is possible at any stage." Miss Peterson's eyes softened. "Your mother, how is Dr. Washington? Retired now, but still publishing, still advocating." "I'm not surprised." She smiled faintly. "That day in my classroom was one of the most uncomfortable of my teaching career, and one of the most important." We talked for nearly an hour. I learned that Ms. Peterson had gone on to get additional certification in ESL education, that she'd become an advocate for linguistic inclusion in her district before retiring 5 years ago. She'd come to this conference specifically for sessions on supporting multilingual learners. As our conversation wound down, she hesitated, then said, "I owe you an apology, Aaliyah. A better one than I managed to give you when you were 11. You don't—" She held up a hand. "I do. I was wrong. Not just pedagogically, but ethically. I tried to make you smaller to fit into my limited understanding of excellence. I'm deeply sorry for that." The sincerity in her voice moved me unexpectedly. "Thank you for saying that." As we prepared to part ways, I noticed her conference materials included a booklet for the session I was presenting the next day. "Will you be attending my presentation?" I asked, gesturing to the booklet. "I will," she confirmed. "I registered weeks ago. When I saw your name in the program, I knew I couldn't miss it." "I look forward to seeing you there," I said warmly. The next day, as I took the podium and looked out at the audience of educators, I spotted Miss Peterson in the 3rd row. As our eyes met, she gave me an encouraging nod, teacher to teacher, colleague to colleague. I began my presentation in my voice, my full, authentic voice, and watched as she took notes, learning from me now as I had once learned from her. Life has a way of bringing us full circle sometimes. Ms. Peterson and I recently collaborated on a curriculum guide for teaching linguistic diversity in middle school English classes. We've presented together at 2 conferences, sharing our intertwined story as a case study in growth, reconciliation, and the evolution of educational practice. Last week, I received a package from her, a ceramic apple with a note that read, "For a teacher who truly has made something of herself. Thank you for teaching me as much as I once tried to teach you." The apple sits on my desk now, a reminder that transformation is always possible, that even the most entrenched perspectives can shift when approached with both conviction and compassion. Have you ever had someone try to correct your authentic voice? Or perhaps you've been the one doing the correcting, only to realize later that you were enforcing arbitrary standards rather than facilitating true communication. I'd love to hear your experiences. If my story resonates with you, please share it with someone who might need to be reminded that their voice, their authentic voice, belongs in every space they enter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my mother hadn't been at that classroom door at exactly the right moment. Would I have continued to shrink myself? Would I have lost my voice entirely? The thought makes me even more determined to be that person, that witness, that advocate for my own students now. Because everyone deserves to be heard in the fullness of who they are. Everyone deserves to speak their truth in their own voice, not just the voice someone else has deemed as proper.